Hey everybody, and welcome to the next edition of the Religion Lectures for the COVID series. This is for Soka University for Buddhism. We're going to do Buddhism-1 today. We're going to get introduced to the history, some of the mythology, and the basic premises behind Buddhism. And then in our next lecture, we will get into some of the different forms of practice and how it's splintered off. Because remember, once the founder dies, it always splinters, right? So the first thing we want to do is we want to remember the context that Buddhism comes up in. It's an Indian religion. It's kind of coming out of that Hindu milieu sort of thing. So remember, it's coming up in about 500 BCE. This is the same time that the Upanishads are really starting to gain ground in the culture. And remember, the Upanishads were a much more mystical view of the world and the soul, and we had the ideas of Atman and Brahman coming together as one thing in its ultimate reality, right? And Buddhism is going to pick up on a lot of that. The basic assumptions of Buddhism are, first of all, the wheel of samsara, and it sucks, right? It's not really this idea of rebirth the way that we tend to think about it. It's really the idea of re-death, this constant transmigration of the soul from one life to another. And you build up karma, either good or bad, and that transmutes you to another life. It kind of leads you into the next life. Whether you go up or down or remain as you are, depends on your karma. We have Atman and Brahman basically being the same things, but even though we experience it as a plurality, we experience the Atman as an individual, we experience the world as separate from the world, and yet in its ultimate reality, you, me, the cosmos, my cat, the ant on the ground, the computer in front of you, it's all the same thing, right? It's all interconnected. It's all about your dharma and your duty. And remember, within the Hindu cycle, and this is the context for Buddhism, dharma and your duty dictate how you build up good or bad karma, right? So if you do your duty, you're building up good karma. If you don't do your duty in whatever way, you're building up bad karma. So, but you also have to remember within this cycle, and shortly after the Upanishads, we start getting some of the great literature, including the Mahabharata, my personal favorite, and that conversation with Arjuna and Krishna, right? So Arjuna and Krishna are having this conversation about dharma and karma, and Arjuna is concerned because he's saying, I don't want to go to battle. If I go to battle and I kill all these people, my cousins, my uncles, my teachers, and all of these people die, I will build up bad karma. And Krishna comes to him and says, first of all, it's your duty. It is your dharma. You are born into the warrior caste. It's your duty to fight this battle. This battle's already been fought. You're just acting as the tool of the god. Second, you don't want to build up good karma either, because that's going to keep you on the wheel of samsara. So the idea is to do your duty, do your dharma, but do it without intention. Do it without commitment to an outcome. Just do it. Right? And this is really hard to kind of get your head wrapped around, because how would I go into battle and not be connected or somehow intending to win or lose, right? There's this question of why would you go into battle with no intention? But Krishna very specifically states, you do this as the tool of the gods, and you're done. And you don't build up any karma. And that's really the best thing to do. Not good, not bad, no karma. The goal in Buddhism is that you have to, or you want to, you don't have to, obviously, you want to achieve moksha, which is kind of this release from the wheel of samsara. Not even kinda, it is the release from the wheel of samsara. And if you can get off the freaking wheel, yes, right, that is ultimately success, is getting off the damn wheel. So you can either fulfill your duty and build up good karma and hope that it takes you to a later opportunity to attain moksha. That's what most people are trying to do. The other thing you can do is you can take the path of renunciation and really try to attain moksha, but that's going to be a very hard path. And so that's going to be the path of the sannyasa, the renunciator, the monk, the ascetic, right? The guy who is out in the wilderness in nothing but his robe and his begging bowl, trying to survive and yet trying to deny the body and the self, because the self doesn't really exist. So into this context is born a young boy. He is born of his mother's side. It's an exceptional birth, right? And of course, this is the mythology. Siddhartha Gautama. So here's a really quick version of the origin story. He is born, and we do have some good indication that he was a real person, a little bit more than we actually have for Jesus. He was born around 566, born into the Brahmin caste, to a king, actually. But we don't really know what became of him beyond that historically. We have the stories, right? So he is the son of a king. In his previous lives, according to the Buddhists, he had a ton of lives to prepare for this, including studying under other Buddhas, right? So he gets born into this life. He is born of his mother's side, like I said, and he announces, as soon as he's born, he takes 7 steps to the north, and he announces that he is the best one on the planet, and this is his last life. And he is an exceptional human being. And the father, of course, takes note of this and calls for the prophets, the oracles, right? The soothsayers, the astrological chart drawers, and those kinds of people. And they all say, first of all, they notice that his stars have aligned in a certain way. They notice that on the palm of his hand is actually a wheel with 8 spokes, okay? And this is supposed to portend something really, really amazing. He will be the one who turns the wheels. He is a truly great person. Now, there's a couple of different ways that he might do this. He might become a great king and turn the wheels by being a great leader and uniting India, or he might be a great sage. All right. Now, his father wants him to become a great king. And his father wants him to, kind of unite India and have India under his rule. So his dad goes to great pains to insulate his son from anything that might dissuade him from that path, right? So he only lives in the palace, this big palace, and he has a beautiful wife eventually and a young son. He is insulated from suffering. He is insulated from philosophy, right? There's all these things that he never really experiences. And then one night he gets his cousin and he says, hey, I want to go outside. I want to go exploring. And his cousin is kind of, we're not supposed to do that. But Siddhartha convinces him and they go out several nights in a row. And on the first night he goes out, he experiences something that he had never experienced before. He sees a person who is ill. This person is very sick, and he looks at him, and, the guy is, maybe barfing up something or is groaning in pain. And Siddhartha says, what is going on here? This makes no sense. What's happening? And his cousin says, well, this person is ill. He's sick. And he's suffering because he is ill. His body is not well. And Siddhartha is very troubled by this. But they go home and, go forward with life. The next night, they leave and they see another person. And this person looks very weird. Their skin is all wrinkled. Their hair is very thin and gray. And they don't move very well. They're kind of hunched over. And Siddhartha says, what is happening here? And his cousin says, well, this person is old. Their knees ache and their skin is wrinkled and their hair is not, like it was in their youth. She is old. Siddhartha is very troubled by this, but they go home and they move on with their lives for the next day. They go out again, the third night, and Siddhartha sees a corpse. He has never seen this before in his life, and it really startles him. And he says, "What is this?" And of course, his cousin has to tell him that is a dead body. The person is dead. The Atman has left, and this person is now in the process of reincarnating into a new body. After they have grown up, become ill, gotten old, and then they die. They go away. And this is the body that is left, being ritually bathed in the Ganges, and will soon be put on the funeral pyre where the body will be burned up. Siddhartha, again, incredibly bothered by this. This is not okay. This is a lot of suffering that he has never seen or experienced in his own life. They go out again, and they see a man who is meditating, who looks very odd, old and skinny and frail. And he says, well, he's old, but he does not look exactly like the other old person. He's skinny, but he is not ill. What is happening? And his cousin has to explain, well, he is an ascetic. He has renounced everything. He has renounced material wealth. He has renounced his body. He has renounced himself in an effort to gain release from samsara, in an effort to gain moksha. And this rings true for Siddhartha. This becomes a really seminal moment. And Siddhartha goes home and realizes that his life is empty, that there is really nothing. If this is all going to end, if this is all destined to die, there is no point in this, right? So he comes out and he becomes a sannyasa, or a sannyasi, depending on the dialect. He becomes an ascetic seeking moksha. He is looking for complete renunciation of who he is. And as a sannyasi, that is what he will endeavor to do. With little or no possessions, he will have a robe to cover his body, and he will have his begging bowl, and that's about it. He will likely go and bathe in the Ganges and be put on a symbolic funeral pyre, and in that way symbolically die and renounce everything that he was and become kind of a new person. So if all action is karma, and you cannot wipe out action, right? If you are living, you act, you speak, you move, you say things, you think things. These are all actions, so you cannot wipe out the actions, but maybe you can wipe out the I. And that's what the sannyasa is trying to do. They're trying to get rid of their intention. They're trying to get rid of the I behind the action. And again, this goes back to that Arjuna story, right? In the Mahabharata, right? It is a Hindu idea at its origin, but Buddhism is going to take it to the next level, all right? As a monk, still Hindu, as a monk, he joined a group that was trying to find moksha by denying the self, and the way they were going about this was by starving themselves. But at the end of that, he is skin and bones, he is barely able to move, he has no energy, and yet the I persists, the hunger persists. He doesn't get any results, he doesn't achieve the enlightenment that he was looking for. So he finally sits down among his peers and he accepts a little bit of rice pudding that a young girl gives him. And his other sannyasas walk away from him. They leave him there for betraying what they're trying to do. And he realizes that the extremes are not the way to get to moksha. You have to take a middle path. No extremes, not even to the self. You cannot deny the self. You are here. You exist. You can't deny that, right? But the other side is that you cannot be overly indulgent in the self. You cannot be a slave to your own desires and wants. And so that's kind of the first steps that he takes towards this new tradition, this new religion. You cannot deny or affirm your own embodiment. So he goes out and he sits and he meditates under the Bodhi tree. And he sits there for several days and nights, only eating rice that the young girl is bringing him, or a young woman. And eventually, as he sits there, he comes closer and closer to enlightenment, to the realization, the full, true, internalized understanding of reality, right? Knowing it intellectually is one thing, right? That's the logos, that's the mind. We can talk about it. We can put it into words, but to truly internalize it and know it on that really deep level is a whole other thing. And that's what he's looking for. And as he gets closer and closer to that moment, the god Mara appears. Mara is the embodiment of death. And the first thing Mara does is he sends his daughters to tempt Siddhartha. So he sends a bunch of his young lady daughters who are beautiful and sensual, right, to dance before him. And I feel like this is really interesting because we have this duality of war and sexuality in lots of different traditions. We see it in Greek mythology with the affair between Aphrodite and Ares. We see it in the Middle East with Inanna Ishtar, who is the goddess of sex and war, right? So this idea of sexuality and war being tied together, I think, is very interesting. But here we go. Mara is sending his daughters to tempt Siddhartha with sensuality and sexuality. Now, fortunately, it doesn't work. He doesn't buy it. He doesn't fall for it. He realizes that that's just a pull of the body, and the body is not the end of reality. The next thing he does is he sends in his armies, and he's trying to scare Siddhartha with his, the last vestiges of mortality, with the last vestiges of his mortal lives. He's trying to scare him. You're going to lose your life if you stay here. But Siddhartha has already figured out that it doesn't matter. There is no I. There is no life. If Atman and Brahman are the same thing and it's all one thing, it doesn't matter, right? Siddhartha, with the approaching army, Siddhartha reaches down and he touches the earth. He puts his hand down, and the earth shakes in acknowledgement of his conviction. And he continues to meditate, and the armies and the young ladies disappear. He goes deeper into meditation, and he becomes the Shakyamuni Buddha. He is from the tribe of the Shakya, so that's where that comes from. So he is the awakened one, and he becomes the Buddha incarnate, right? So he is still incarnate, he's still in the body, but the Buddha is one who has flowered. The word Buddha gets used for things like the opening of roses or waking from sleep, so it becomes awakened. But some people also say that his wisdom flowers or opens up, right? So he figures out, and this becomes kind of the core of much of what he is at the heart of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths. And we're going to go deeper into these today before we're done. The first truth is dukkha. There is suffering. Suffering is everywhere. There is always suffering. The second truth is trishna. The suffering comes because you want things, you thirst for them. Trishna. The fourth one is that there is release. That release he calls nirvana, and the way there is the Eightfold Path, or the middle way. All right. So he has achieved nirvana, but he remains in the body, right? But he understands the causes of suffering, and he blows them out. He extinguishes the causes of suffering, and therefore he extinguishes his own suffering. If you don't want, you don't suffer, right? So we're going to talk a little bit more about nirvana as well in a couple of minutes. So he gets up. He is tempted to leave, but he stays. He gets up, he goes to a local town, and he teaches what he has learned to some ascetics. This is the first turning of the wheel of the law. All right? This is the beginning of Buddhist teaching. He hands it on even though he knows that no one's really going to get it. It's the hope that maybe one person down the line will understand, and this is his compassion. He knows that it's probably not going to make a difference, but he does it anyway, with the hope, or at least with knowing that the opportunity will be there. I shouldn't use the word hope because that implies want. He understands that the opportunity will be there for someone to get it if they can. He taught to anyone who would listen. He established monastic orders, including nuns, and female ascetics in India are very, very rare. They're not common, and it wasn't really allowed for women to become ascetics. Within Hindu society, men are allowed to, and to some degree later in life, are encouraged to renounce their lives and their world, and their wives can come with them, but women are not on their own ascetics, okay? But he establishes monks and nuns. He teaches for many years, for about 40 years or so, and he gives his last teaching. He lays down and passes away to complete nirvana or parinirvana. Before he passes away, there's a little story where he's getting ready to teach his last teaching, and he's looking for the monk or the follower that will understand it. And, many are there going, I totally get it. I totally understand it. And they're trying to explain it back to him. And there's one monk that comes up, and the monk doesn't say anything. He just smiles. And that's how Siddhartha knows that he understands, and he kind of passes the torch to that young man, or older man, really. The Buddha's body is cremated, and his relics are then distributed among the monks and nuns, who then pass on his teachings as well. So with his death, what was left for his followers, right? I talked about the relics, right? The things that were left behind. And these become places of veneration and worship. So his begging bowl, his robe, anything he may have touched, anything he may have stepped on, all of those things become relics of the Buddha. And you can see these buildings set up, and they're called stupas. But it's not unlike a Christian relic, right? And there's all kinds of cathedrals all over Europe, and similarly in the East, all over Turkey and Egypt, right? There's these places where they will have relics of saints and maybe even of Jesus or Mary or whatever. People come there and venerate the relics, and it becomes a focal point for the faithful, right? And these Buddhist relics are functioning in the same way. It becomes a focal point for the faithful if they choose to do that. And this becomes the form body of the Buddha, right? So this is the physical remains. His teachings are also left behind and passed down, all right? And this is called his Dharma, the way to awakening, his second body of the Buddha, the eternal and unchanging Dharma. So the teachings are to be spread through the Sangha, the monks and the nuns. This is the Bodhidharma. It is beyond the gods. So in Hindu, Upanishadic Hinduism, the gods are not necessarily permanent. They may last 1,000,000 years. They may last 2,000,000 years. They may, they will be here for generations, and yet at some point they will be gone. They will be forgotten. They will no longer exist, and they too will be reincarnated in some way, shape, or form, maybe as a human being, maybe as another god, who knows. But you and I could also, if you create enough good karma, could go up to being a divine being, or maybe even a God. Now, this is within conceptually possible, right? So the Buddha comes out of this and notes that the gods are not permanent either, right? But the Bodhidharma is eternal, right? And this is based around those four noble truths that I mentioned before. The first truth, of course, is that everything is suffering. The world is suffering. So there are, if everything is suffering, we have multiple forms of suffering that he talked about. We have suffering, physical suffering, like the most basic form of suffering. And this would be everything from paper cuts to broken bones, right? Terrible physical suffering to even minor physical suffering. And if you're embodied, you have banged your pinky toe against a chair leg or something, and that is suffering, right? Even for a few minutes, it's terrible suffering that causes much cussing and screaming and yelling and bad moods. There is also transformational suffering because generally speaking, people hate change. And you'll notice even for good things, we suffer anxiety, even for something good. If you are trying something new, you have anxiety. If you're starting a business, if you are graduating from college, when you graduate, oh my God, the amount of anxiety. What am I going to do next, right? There's a huge amount of anxiety around change. That anxiety is a form of suffering. But also suffering, and this they call this from states of conditioned, right? Conditioned states, what I meant. Getting older is a conditioned state, right? So that's its own form of suffering, knowing that your life is kind of slowly escaping you. We also have suffering due to our illusions about ourselves and the world around us, right? Expectations versus ultimate reality can create suffering. Many people, and I think, especially in California, we are perhaps, well, hopefully, hopefully, more aware of this, but we are also possibly more subject to this. But we all look at TV and stuff and we're like, oh, if I have fame or if I have money, if I have this stuff, if I have that cake, if I have another Frappuccino, it will make me happy. And yet it doesn't really do that for any real length of time. And many wealthy, famous people will tell you that all of the money in the world doesn't matter if you are missing really key components of your internal self. Money cannot fill the holes in your soul, in your emotional life, in your heart. It won't fill it. And so that is its own form of suffering due to our illusions about ourselves and the world around us. Our expectations, our hopes bring suffering. So if there is no self, and this is part of that thing about impermanence, right? And so remember, the ultimate reality is Atman and Brahman are all one thing. Everything is united. There is no real soul. There's no real self. So if there's no self, who the heck is watching this video? And who made it, right? The self is comprised of these aggregates, and they're called skandhas. They are layers of illusion that kind of work together to make us believe or make us feel like there is solidness and stability where there really isn't. All right. And there are 5 skandhas. Buddhism loves a list. There is material form, right? There is the table, the computer, myself, this body, right? There is sensation, the fact that I can feel the table is hard and smooth. The fact that I can feel that my fingers are a little bit cold. Ideas, things going on in your head is part of it. Your will, this thing where you're making decisions, right? And consciousness. They're all momentary, but they come together to create illusions of continuity and presence. And even in modern physics and consciousness and but brain biology, they're starting to question some of these things, and we can't quite pin down some of them, including consciousness. We can't quite find the origins of that. So they're all coming together to make us feel like there is continuity. And so sometimes this gets compared to an onion, right? Where you have layers and layers and layers and layers and layers. And when you run out of layers, you don't have any onion. It's been compared to a river that is flowing. So it looks constant, but it's ever changing. It's compared to a burning fire. The soul, the self is a suffering flame, ever burning off karma, right? And even your good karma has to be burned off. So even there is suffering. Permanence always dissolves, right? So if there's no self and there's no real continuity, everything is always changing. You are not the same person you were yesterday or 5 years ago or 10 years ago or even 5 minutes ago. You are constantly in flux. The change may be really slow and not noticeable, but it's always working. And so there is no real permanent identity. Let's let that cook your noodle for a minute. So I'm coming back to the Dalai Lama. And most people who have experienced the Dalai Lama, and myself included, he's got a very, he's almost like a little boy. He's just very happy. And if everything is suffering, why are you so freaking happy? If everything is suffering, how can you smile at the world? When, especially in Tibet, your people are under Chinese rule and they're not being allowed to freely practice. Governments are, crumbling and people are suffering, and yet you smile. Not just a little smile like a smirk, but like a little boy, a little giddy smile, right? If there is no permanence, there is no permanent suffering. This too shall pass. And in the great scheme of things, in the grand scale, when it's, the really big picture, this is just a blip. This is just another blip. And that allows for an ability to let things go. And that leads to a lightness. Yes, everything is suffering, but it's not permanent. It's not a permanent state. You're going to eventually figure out a way to nirvana. You too can figure out enlightenment. And that is the ultimate reality. So it's okay that things change, because you don't want to attach yourself to all of that crap around you. It's going to change. Everything is going to change. So if you're having a good time, if right now your life is in a party stage, enjoy the party. Be present in that moment of that joy. And if your life is in suffering, if you are in a time of despair, know that the despair is not going to last. Be present in that moment, but realize that neither of those things are things that you can attach to permanently, because they will change. All right? Once you realize that, you have no desire to change or to keep things the way they are. You simply let them go the way they go. And you experience the roller coaster for what it is, according to Buddhist thought. A roller coaster. It's a ride. And so the Dalai Lama smiles. We are suffering from this 12-fold change of dependent arising. And this is a little different from the skandhas. All right. We're not going to do all 12 of the dependent arisings. So we're going to kind of squish it down a little bit. Basically, these dependent arisings come from ignorance. that lead to desire, that lead to rebirth, or in the case of the way the Hindus might put it, re-death. And I think the Buddhists would probably put it as re-death as well in many ways, right? So birth and death end up in suffering because you're embodied, right? So I gave you some images here, and I'm giving you a little more insight into me. When we see these images, when I see these images, it makes me want to go to Yosemite. I love Yosemite. I adore Yosemite. But I can't go because I don't have time. I don't have money. I don't have the camping gear anymore. There's all kinds of reasons why I can't go. I look at the backwoods and I realize that, I know to your shock, I'm not in shape enough to go hiking in the backwoods, and I don't have the gear again. So I have bad ankles as well, so lots of hiking is not good. I want to be in nature, I want to be camping, but my back will not forgive me for that. I want to be in pristine wilderness, but it no longer exists really, right? Human beings have been everywhere, and for the most part, we have spoiled most of nature. And when I look at that lake, I want to drink from it because it looks like crystal clear, cold water, and looks lovely. But I also know there's probably a lot of microorganisms in it that I probably don't want to take into my body. So all of this want, right, from the dependent arisings, leaves me sad because I want it. So we have dukkha, the first noble truth, and now we have trishna, the second noble truth, desire. I want, right? And I'm going to give you a kind of more mainstream example here. Dior's new fragrance, right? Sauvage, I guess, something like that, right? So Dior is never going to make you younger, slimmer, sexier, cooler, tougher, or anything else. Even Johnny Depp doesn't look that way. And Johnny Depp isn't really Johnny Depp the way we think of him, right? But that's what we want. We want to buy the fragrance. We want to buy the hair care product. We want to get the clothing. We want the Birkin bag. We want. And there's all kinds of things that you might want. That may not be your cup of tea. You might be like me. I want to go to Yosemite and hike the backwoods, but I am not skilled in that. I am not in shape for that, and I do not have the gear for that. There's all kinds of reasons I can't do it. And part of me doesn't want to go through the suffering that would be required to get that prize, right? So there's suffering because I want it, and then there would be suffering to try to get it. And so this is all suffering. So again, there is nothing that's going to give you everything you want. And even if you had everything you wanted, what then? Right? And so this is all for a form of ignorance, right? So ignorance leads to desire, which leads to rebirth. So we have to remove the ignorance, and that will lead to a diminished desire, and that will hopefully, if you can do that well enough, eventually unravel rebirth, right? This is not going to happen in one lifetime, so you kind of have to get the process started and continue it through multiple lifetimes, all right? Next up, we have nirvana, which is that third noble truth, right? A lot of people, especially in the West, would equate nirvana or moksha with heaven, but that's not it. That's not it. In the West, again, we tend to work with dualities. We have heaven and hell. And if you're Catholic, maybe you put purgatory in the middle there. Nirvana is not heaven. Nirvana is the extinguishing of the fire of the self and desire and want, right? So nirvana is the cessation of existence. It's the absence of all things, including nothing. All right, I'm going to say this again because I really want you to try to get your head around this, okay? Nirvana is the absence of all things, including nothing. All right. So it comes to the Buddha with his first awakening. He knows the fire will go out. He knows that this is his last life. And then that's the nirvana with residue. He's still working off a little tiny bit of karma, the kind of soot on the edge of the candle holder. The second one is his complete extinction, and that's where he actually passes away, and the body is fully, the body is burned up and everything is gone. He is released from the cycle without residue. I would equate this a little bit to kind of give you maybe a slightly better idea of nirvana. If you talk to a die-hard atheist, like a full-on materialist, and I think this is ironic that I'm using this because a materialist atheist, someone who does not believe in a soul because we cannot prove it scientifically, right? We cannot show it. So if we're looking at like Richard Dawkins or somebody like that, I can't stand that guy. They would say there is no soul, and when you die, it just goes to black. That's it. You're not suffering, you're not happy, because there is nothing to suffer or be happy. There's nothing left to feel those things. So there is no soul. We just pass into nothingness. There's nothing left, except that for nirvana, there's not nothing, but it's not something. Right? So get rid of the heaven idea, go to blackness and nothing, but realize that nothing is not there either. Okay? You got to get past the dualism. Hinduism and Buddhism are going to push you to move past this dualistic thinking. It's not black, it's not white, but it's not gray, and it's not the colors either. But it's not the absence of those things either. Okay? I'm going to let you think about that for a second. So with his experience of nirvana and enlightenment, he was free to not suffer, right? So as he still lived, and I think the Dalai Lama to some extent is the same way, understanding the enlightenment, he is free to not suffer because he is free of desire. But he's still compassionate. He's not fully detached. He's not uncaring, right? It's not like he suddenly became a computer. He is still embodied. The Buddha was still embodied. So he is still part of the human experience, but he has moved past the ignorance of the human experience, right? That thing that leads us to desire. And so that allows the Buddha or any bodhisattva that might be wandering around to still pass on the teachings and help other people. All right? So this leads us to the fourth noble truth, the path, the Eightfold Path. So the Eightfold Path is right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, right understanding, and right aspiration. Now, you do not have to know all those things. If somebody said, hey, Nan, what's the Eightfold Path? I could probably come up with 6 of them. Don't worry about it. This typically gets reduced down to 3. Right moral conduct, which would include speech, action, and livelihood. Right mental concentration, so effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And then right wisdom, understanding, and aspiration. So when you are working the path, of course, you want right speech, action, and livelihood. You don't want to hurt others in any way, shape, or form. You don't want to inflict pain on others, right? So you avoid that. Mental concentration would involve meditation, allowing your mind to get rid of pesky thoughts, right? emptying the mind, allowing the mind to be an empty vessel. And there are many ways to do this. I've heard many ways to do this. One person has told me, think of water. No bubbles, no ground, no surface, no background, just water. Right? And if you try to focus on that, water, of course, takes the shape and light and color of the things around it. So if you get rid of all those things, there's nothing, right? It's essentially nothingness. When I'm trying to do this kind of thing, I focus on the inside of my eyelids. That's usually my trick. Other people have, especially Zen monks will focus on a flame, and so it's a very common practice as well. Kind of just putting one thing at the center and focusing everything there. You also have right wisdom, right understanding, and aspiration. So that would include getting rid of ignorance, right? Understanding why you suffer, and then getting rid of the reason that you suffer, and therefore not suffering anymore. And right aspiration, compassion. That's it. Just compassion, right? All right, so this is at the core of Buddhism. I'm going to let you kind of nosh on this mentally for a while. There's a lot in here. If your brain, remember, I think I said before, when I teach Buddhism, I say, okay, does everybody get it? And especially my students who grow up in this Judeo-Christian background, if you're saying, yeah, I totally get it, either you've been exposed to it before or you are not getting it. So I want you to nosh on this for a little bit. Let it roll around in your brain for a little while. Be confused. And then we'll come back next week, most likely, and work on the other parts of it. And we're going to start looking at how people have practiced it, what its most common practices are, and how it has splintered and kind of come into the West as well. All right? Ladies and gentlemen, have a good week. I will see you in the afternoons on Tuesday or Thursday. Please stay well. Please be careful. And please do whatever you have to do to keep your own sanity intact. Okay? I will see you soon. Have a good one.